Gina and I have been married now over 30 years, and in almost every way we are complementary towards each other, which I think makes for a good marriage, except for one area, and that has quite often caused us both frustration. When something at our home has broken down, or leaked, or fell down, or become in some sort of disrepair, I probably should have looked for a wife who was comfortable wearing a tool belt. And she probably should have looked for a husband who knew which end of a screwdriver to pick up. A big part of that frustration comes from not being able, when our home has had some problems, to diagnose the issue. When you're not very knowledgeable about plumbing systems or electrical systems or heating and air systems, it is difficult to know where even to begin to look for the source of the problem. It is hard even in talking to repairmen over the phone to describe what is occurring that needs to be fixed, let alone knowing where to look for the solution. A lot of folks that I end up talking to on a daily basis, now in my job as pastor here, but in my previous work as a counselor, both at Patrick Harris Hospital and the Greenville Mental Health Center, a lot of folks had a similar problem, knowing where to look for either the source of their problem or find a solution. People would come seeking counseling because they would be depressed, but they didn't know why they were depressed many times. And they certainly did not know how to get not depressed. They felt hopeless, confused, and sometimes death seemed the only way out. They did not know where to look for relief. Maybe they looked to alcohol or drugs, which brought some temporary, momentary relief, but in the end left them broke, without a job, without a family, and sometimes in trouble with that guy right over there. The law. Maybe sometimes folks, when they're down, look to relationships with others as the cure, but then become so needy and dependent on loved ones that they drive them away. Maybe sometimes folks look to possessions to meet their needs, thinking if they just could acquire that one more thing, whether it be a boat or a house or a car or even technology, then they would no longer be depressed. Instead, they end up finding themselves buried in debt. Maybe some folks have looked to the past for the answer, thinking if things could only go back to the way they used to be, then I would be happy. At the root of the uneasiness, the discontent in our lives many times is a loss of focus. We don't know where to look for help. We don't know where to look for comfort. We don't know where to go for healing. We don't know where to look for hope. Nicodemus meets Jesus, and we get the idea that Nicodemus is really looking for something. After all, why would a man like Nicodemus even take time to question Jesus? Nicodemus was an outstanding member of his community. Roger Fredrickson in his commentary says how fascinating that a member of the who's who of Jerusalem should seek out Jesus, a rustic itinerant preacher. Could Nicodemus have anything in common with Jesus? This man of the Pharisees, Nicodemus, which means he was one of the separated ones. He was an elite lay theologian dedicated to studying and living out every jot and tittle of the law, and a ruler of the Jews, it says about him, meaning he was a member of the Sanhedrin, that exclusive council which controlled the religious life of Israel. Nicodemus was an important, busy man. who you would expect would not have time. Fool with a carpenter's son from Nazareth. But evidently Jesus has caught Nicodemus' attention. Maybe word of the miraculous signs Jesus has been performing, or word of how he has boldly cleared the temple of the money changers, or word of the following he was picking up. All that perhaps had come to Nicodemus. But whatever it was, Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night, it says, searching and questioning. He wants to know, what are you all about, Jesus? The answer Jesus gives him doesn't sound so strange, maybe to those of us who have grown up in evangelical Christian churches. After all, we have tossed that term born again around so much that it's part of our culture, as is motherhood and apple pie, right? But to Nicodemus, these are strange words. When Jesus says, unless one is born again, one cannot see the kingdom of God. Born again, says Nicodemus. What in the world are you talking about, Jesus? How can a grown person be born again? Why, you can't enter a second time your mother's womb, can you, and be born again? It was not a physical birth Jesus was speaking of. Jesus was talking about a radical transformation of one's life that could be compared to a complete new start, to a total rebirth. Jesus says that in order for us to even recognize the kingdom, let alone become citizens of God's kingdom, we have to have a total realignment of our view, our perspective. Where once we may have looked out there in that direction for our life's purpose, where once we may have looked over there for our happiness, where once we may have looked up there for what kind of people we are to be, now Jesus says, look to one place, and that is to the cross. Where once maybe things like success in a job, or finding financial security, or making our family happy, or living up to a loved one's expectations, or protecting our own health, or other things are the driving forces which guide us and guide what we do and who we are. Jesus says now the cross must become the focus of our lives. And we see the world, and we see each other, and we see ourselves, and we see God totally different. One of my favorite writers, Tony Campolo, tells a story that when he was a boy growing up in Philadelphia, the night before Halloween was designated as Mischief Night. On that night, he says, the adults of our neighborhood braced themselves against all sorts of petty crimes at the hands of the younger generations. Windows were soaked. You remember that day? We soaked the windows. Air was let out of tires. All that annoying mischief that an adolescent mind could conjure up. One year, he says, my best friend and I devised what we thought was a brilliant and creative plan for mischief. We decided to break into the basement of the local Five and Dime store. We did not plan to rob the store. He said Sunday school boys wouldn't do something like that. But instead, he said, we planned to do something that, as far as the owner of the store was concerned, would have been even far worse. Our plan, he says, was to get into that Five and Dime store and change the price tags on things. He said, we imagined what it would be like the next morning when people came into the store and they discovered that radios were selling for $0.25 and bobby pins were priced at $5 each. He says with diabolical glee, we wondered what it would be like in that store when nobody could figure out what the prices of things should really be. Paul says, sometimes I think Satan has played the same kind of trick on all of us. Sometimes, he says, I think he has broken into our lives and he has changed the price tag on things. Too often, we treat what deserves to be treated with loving care as though it were a little work. And on the other hand, we find ourselves tempted to make great sacrifices for that which, in the long run of life, has no lasting value and delivers, in the end, very little sense of peace. Perhaps, he says, one of the worst consequences of our being fallen creatures is our failure to understand what is truly important in my life. Jesus wants to change the price tags in our lives. He wants to completely reorder our perspective. He wants to turn us around 180 degrees so that we see things as citizens of God's kingdom instead of the kingdoms of this world. So where do we look to find purpose? Where do we go to uncover hope for our lives? Where do we look when we're in distress and need help? Where do we look to find security and belonging? Perhaps we've been looking in all the wrong places. The psalm writer says in Psalm 121, I will lift up my eyes to the hills. From whence does my help come? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. When the Israelites were in distress in the wilderness, remember they had left slavery in Egypt under the leadership of Moses. And they were traveling towards this unknown promised land. Largely due to their own failure to trust God and his servant, they were in quite distress. So God told Moses to do a really strange thing. He told him to make a brass serpent and to place it on a pole and to lift it high where everyone could see it. The serpent was a symbol, in fact, of what was creating much of their distress and their pain, for they were being bit by fiery serpents out there in the wilderness. And God instructs Moses to tell the people to look up at that serpent on the pole, and in there, looking up at that serpent, they would find healing. Jesus later takes that very story in Scripture and says, I am that serpent on the pole. Because Jesus goes to the cross, and there he suffers terribly unto death for us. He says, look to him. Look up to him on that cross to find our healing and wholeness, our forgiveness and peace. So this morning, where do we look for help? We're all feeling a little unsettled these days, right? Who can we trust? Who can we believe? Where's our help going to come from? who will be the source of our hope and our healing, and truly offer us abundant life. Maybe we've been looking in all the wrong places. I love that hymn. I don't recall at the moment who wrote it, and I hate that in our Methodist hymnal we only have the chorus. But the words of the chorus perhaps are the answer to that question. Where do we look when he says, turn your eyes where? Upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face. And when we do that, the things of earth, all those things we stress ourselves out of, all those things we think we cannot possibly live without, all those things will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. Lord, reorder our lives to the point that we can see you. We can see each other. We can see the world around us and see ourselves in the light of your grace. Forgive us when we've taken our eyes off of you and we've made other things more important than you. Lead us back. Restore to us a sense of balance and peace, so that no matter what's happening in the world around us, you remain our strong center, the anchor to which we hold.